Hello everyone, today we talk about Islamic thought between the 9th and the 12th century, and we will concentrate chiefly on Mu'tazilism, Ismailism and Sufism. So this is not going to be a strictly comparative video between Christian philosophy and Islamic philosophy during this period, but I think it's still important that there are some cross sections, we can say, between and similar developments in these worlds at the same time. In these centuries, the two great areas of Christianity, that is the West and the Byzantine Empire, were progressively defining an increasingly distinct ecclesiastical physiognomy that would culminate, by the way, also with a schism among the other things. And the Muslim world was knowing very deeply conflictual religious experiences that were actually triggered by different forms of sensibility that were in increasingly more intimate connection with the fortunes of the Arab political formations and the introduction also of new peoples in the immense area of Islam. And Islam, however, had a very impressive and complexively, at least, ability of cultural development at this time that was, by the way, using the classical legacy, actually not less intensely than what was happening in Constantinople, nor within the Western monks and clergymen, if not, on the contrary, even with more with bolder intellectual confidence, which is very interesting to think, because this has probably to do with a matter of cultural resistance. The Western world had come straight from millennia of intellectual development in many ways. So, and this is not really always an advantage. At this time, by the way, we're talking about the end of the early Middle Ages. We are in the High Middle Ages, so this is the moment in which actually the West had forgotten a lot about its classical past, but was still recovering massively it. Which was done, by the way, also thanks to Islamic, with contact with the Islamic world, that in this sense was, let's say, had this fallout of cultural fallout that came into the West chiefly through manuscripts, to the great translations of, think about Aristotle, and we will see now also figures like Al-Farabi and Avicenna, etc. But in a certain sense, the West was still attached. It had never forgotten its past. There is this very flat, unidimensional, and pretty depressing prejudice that many people have today about the Middle Ages as a dark hole where people have forgotten it. This is actually false. Throughout the whole Middle Ages, people kept studying the ancient world. There's never been neither a time in which this was not done. The models were all there. The manuscripts were there. The Middle Ages had an amazing intellectual development, a huge thirst of knowledge. They're the century par excellence of the great intellectual systematization of universal knowledge. So this happened both in the West and in the East. Just for saying that, study some medieval literature or philosophy if you have such prejudices, because it's very stupid otherwise for you to even believe such a thing in the first place. And I hope it's less widespread than I suspect. And I don't know why I was getting here. Oh yeah, because for saying, however, that the Westerners had this preset models. I mean, they had their own authorities that incidentally had been educated with classical works. So there had been a selection of the ancient authors since a very early age in the West. Think about late antiquity and how, when Christianism is legalized, and therefore all these Christian thinkers are able to reach the highest levels of of education in the empire, they started eventually to write extra. Think about Saint Augustine. Think about Gerolimus, Ambrosius, or Saint Basil. I mean, all figures that, in this sense, were really not were called auctoritates in Latin, from by now, not surprisingly, and that's where you wanted to stick to, because essentially everything that they had said had a value of a certain kind, and this involved having a relation with the ancient knowledge. Now, the Muslims had a wholly different situation, because Muslims had not, at least the Arabs, had not known such thoughts before. I mean, they had come straight out of the Arabian desert in the 7th century. Now, it is true that talking about Arabs as if, at a certain point Arabs began to rule everywhere, yeah, I mean, there were, at this point between the 9th and 12th century, we can talk about Arabicide elites. I mean, elites that were Muslim, chiefly, and spoke Arab, but that for the rest had nothing else in common, because they were essentially the result of the blending of these Arab newcomers, who were also, by the way, very demographically scarce, with the local aristocracies. So it is true the local aristocracies were already well educated, but at the same time the Islamic teaching was a bit of a totalizing one. So there was immediately the problem of actually integrating all the huge information, the huge knowledge that was found by the Arabs into the lands of the that had conquered, chiefly the ones of the Byzantine Empire, but not only. I mean, the Islam took this great legacy not just from the Hellenistic world, but also from the Indian one, for instance. So this is also interesting about Islamic, medieval Islamic philosophy, because it's not just about Hellenism like in the West. It also takes other influences. Not that the West hadn't known them, because Hellenism also had part of them within itself, but it was mostly a Western thing. Christianity took it from Judaism, chiefly from Hellenic thought, and even if there were so many Eastern influences that you can't find up to China, as far as China, definitely it remained more contained. Islam expanded, by the way, over much broader and different areas of Asia, of Europe, and of North Africa, and this probably gave them, especially all at once. This is also another thing. I mean, the Islamic invasions were very, very fast, the first ones at least, and therefore they got immediately this huge match to cope with from an intellectual point of view, which really posed lots of problems. And as I was saying before, the Quran and the Hadith really didn't pose, in this sense, there wasn't really a precedent. I mean, yeah, of course, in the Quran and also in the Arab tradition at large, there were certain influences from Hellenism, from Judaism as well. Arabia and certain even nomadic Arabs knew Judaism, for instance. There were Jewish communities. Even Muhammad, since the first beginning, had to deal with how to cope with this different religious communities. So, but let's say that culturally speaking, this earliest Islamic tradition was extraneous to the great theological, philosophical debates of the I would keep saying the late antique world at that point, because actually many people, I think, rightfully believed that the late antique world, at least in the East, stopped, at least it finished, ended with the same Arab invasions that really changed a lot of things. It's obviously an approximation, because it's not that the Arabs arrived and who knows what enormously much actually changed. Especially the Islamic rule was pretty light in many ways. I mean, it was surely less imposant than the Byzantine one. It was much heavier. And there is also a big deal. There is another picture also we get in the West, I think, which is another prejudice a bit, is that when the Islamic invasions arrived, it's as if they unified everything and that they formed this unity of some sort. It's completely the other way around. As we were saying before, the caliphate immediately fragmented, and basically the Islamic invasions actually brought to a political fragmentation into an area of the Near East and Mesopotamia that had never been there, historically speaking, because historically speaking there had always been huge empires, one after the other. Take the Assyrians, take then the Persians, then the Alexander and his successors, then Rome, partly were Persia, so there were always these major dominations. With the Islamic invasions, eventually the caliphate fragmented, so actually the unity of those lands went lost forever. And it's not really, I'm not really making a point like of a failure of Islam at all. I mean, given the preconditions, that could have been different as an outcome. But fragmentation at that time was a kind of an obvious thing in many ways, considering the same, can say, the environmental factors. The same Western Europe was dramatically fragmented at this time. So it was, in this sense, it's one of those characters of homogeneity that actually existed between Christianity and Islam at that point. But what I wanted to get to is to the fact that the fragmentation of the Islamic Caliphate from the very first brought to this extreme diversification of basically of everything, of political affiliations, of religious beliefs. I mean, just take a map of Islam and look at how it is complicated. I mean, Islam is really much more diverse than Christianity is. And Christianity is already a very complex world in all its various currents and all. Islam is increasingly more complicated, and actually divisions are much greater than in the West. So this, however, gave to the Islamic world, that was starting in a very privileged way, because it basically controlled some of the most advanced areas of the globe. I mean, if you take the Islamic courts of Baghdad, Baghdad was the I think the most advanced city on earth at this point under the Abbasids. Think about Damascus. There had been the first capital of Caliphate. Think about the Umayyads that remained into Spain. And think about how Cordoba, it was so important. Cordoba was an amazing pole of civilization, also for Christianity itself. So we have to think of this Islamic world as an area of various and very vivacious but superimposed areas of cultural areas, we can say. That definitely had intersections also with the Western world. The Islamic invasions never brought to a thing like an enclosure of the Mediterranean. Trade exchanges went on, kept going on. The myth that, yeah, the Arabs arrived and it was all about war in the Mediterranean. No, it wasn't like that. Definitely, yes, up to which the Roman Empire had existed, had been this major naval power that had kept relative homogeneity, but actually you don't even have to see as war as a stemming factor in this sense, because through war there are certain cultural hybridations that in peace actually do not happen. So actually there was a lot of dynamism that implied also dialogue with the Christian world, and lots of actually of cultural enrichment under this point of view. As we were saying before, think about all the the books. No, I was saying I wasn't saying that before. You haven't heard it because I started recording this before, but I stopped because I was saying many stupid things. So I don't know how this will go either, telling the truth. But I was actually talking about the translations that the Arabs made that eventually came straight to the West and how important they came. Forget about Aristotle. We will talk about figures like Al-Farabi and Avicenna eventually. So, and so what I wanted to get to is that the Islamic world didn't have that tradition that the West have towards the classics. So it kind of came way more freshly onto them when they found them into the Byzantine libraries that they had conquered. Because another myth is that the Muslims destroyed libraries. Not at all. Even the story of the Library of Alexander destroyed by the Caliph, it's false. It's actually a piece of political propaganda that the same Muslims wanted to make to show that the only book they cared about was the Quran. But as a matter of fact, these guys were extremely smart, and the first thing they did was to actually seize those libraries and to read extensively about it. And that's what actually made of Islamic civilization so advanced at this time, because they had inherited all these knowledge that unfortunately in part it is lost, because not all of it came eventually. There were definitely also destructions in Islamic world. Think of all the wars that were fought between within the Muslims themselves. But it's very fascinating to see that in the Islamic tradition and literature, as far as Islam went, so you can find that up to Indonesia, into Central Africa, but what is it? It's sometimes we get, this is very interesting from a philological point of view, that we get actually certain stories, let's say, certain contents of this tradition that we know the Muslims could have not taken them, but from the Greek, let's say from the Byzantine libraries, and that today we are lost, and that they knew. For instance, about travels around the world, actually there are certain Muslim traditions. By the way, the Muslims were extremely obsessed by Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is a much greater hero for in the Muslim tradition than in the Christian one, as a matter of fact. Even if in the Christian one it was all about, I mean, the Christian chivalric epics is not about Christian, it's about Alexander mostly, and but what we know is that together with these stories there were also a lot of knowledge about the ancient world explorations. These Arabs talked about the geysers, for instance. Well, it is true that certain Arab merchants, when they went to Scandinavia, and they sold into Iceland, probably they reached that too, that they saw such things. But actually we feel that from many hints that the Arabs at this point had a huge quantity of knowledge that eventually never arrived back again to the West. So they knew much more actually than Westerners knew about that ancient Hellenistic tradition, which kind of makes sense, because now today we are used to think at our Europe as you know, the fact that eventually we expanded and all. But if you look at it in perspective, actually the Near and Middle East had always been more, on average, more advanced than Europe, on average. So it was a world that was still very rich, very dynamic. It's actually at this point that the West begins basically to surpass, I believe, in potential, very slowly, especially in post-Carolingian times. The Carolingians were the ones who really made it all, even by making a mess, but they made it to transform into Europe in something much more dynamic. I made a video that was the Franks and the Arabs, two empires compared. I think that's the title, in which I explained this thing, if you're interested, by the way. But at this point, indeed, the Islamic East was more advanced at this time, yeah, than the Christian West, at least from a philosophical and an intellectual point of view. And what was said today, so this is a big premise I've made, it was said at that time is what eventually had a huge influence eventually, also up to our days. So I would start with Mutazilism. So what is Mutazilism? Basically, it's a rational school of Islamic theology. It was born. It's between substantially the 8th, chiefly the 9th actually, in the 10th centuries, and the major belief of the Mutazilites is essentially the denial of the Quran as an uncreated and co-eternal. I mean, the status of the Quran as an uncreated and co-eternal with God. And they actually say this by saying, you know, if the Quran is the word of God, God must have necessarily had a thought that preceded his own speech. So that's how, just to give you the setting of how they were reasoning. And the whole philosophical speculation of the Mutazilah, I believe this is the Arab pronunciation, revolves around concepts on divine justice and divine unity. It was actually a school that posed ethically challenging problems, chiefly the problem of evil. How do you reconcile, for instance, the justice of an omnipotent God with the reality of evil of the world, and all these things that we still think today. I mean, as Westerners, that's questions we have heard so many times. So the idea is that this school was born. Mutazila basically means the etymology comes from I don't know how to say it in English, but to distance themselves. And the original thing, in fact, started from a debate in a Muslim circle at this time of the Middle Ages, where basically there was a debate. This happened in the circle of Hassan of Basra. So we are in Mesopotamia, and the whole thing started from the problem of answering whether a person who has committed serious sin was a believer or not. So this is also gives you the idea of more or less what the many problems actually just like this that were being posed at the time. Because those had to be answered from an Islamic perspective on the Quran and on Muhammad's customs, essentially the hadith. Basically this started, I think, from Basil. I don't remember, Ibn Atta. I think it's the name of who is that. There was one of the other debaters who said basically it's not this person who committed this sin could not be a believer in practice, and Basil instead said, okay, no, it's neither a believer nor a non-believer, and withdrew. So that's what Mutazilah actually counted from the study circle, and began this tradition that it's a withdrawal actually not just from this debate. I mean, it's not like these people escaped debates. They simply founded this new school, this new current. But this withdrawal is actually to be understood not just in a purely speculative way. It has to be understood, as a matter of fact, as also a withdrawal from the clashes that were occurring. Also because of these debates, this argument in the Islamic world between the 8th and the 9th century. It is a pretty turbulent time in the Islamic world, a lot of wars, a lot of infight. The Mu'tazilites saw these clashes also partly as coming from non-proper philosophical thinking. And that's where the rationalism actually starts from, because the Mu'tazilites arrived to say that the free will has definitely great importance. This school was trying to legitimize the use of reason in order to do a lot of things, including to explain, for instance, the truth of faith. That is something very bold to do. In the West, I actually don't reckon, in Christianity, I don't remember this, at least at this time, absolutely there was nothing like that. Such thoughts actually began to come later. So you see actually how the Muslims were sometimes even bolder in this philosophical thinking. And definitely this school was also proceeding in formulating to new thoughts. Essentially, could find an answer to such problems. Essentially the Mu'tazilites believed, there is, by the way, this a bit of a prejudice that wants the Mu'tazilites to be a sort of this rational school in front of traditionalism. Actually, this is also of the Islamic world. This is also pretty modernistic conception. These people were not rationalists as we imagine now today, and even their opposers weren't really anti-rational at all. I mean, it was more of different premises in which actually believing in Islam and finding solutions to and I'll try to explain myself better. First of all, the Mu'tazilites actually developed rationally the idea of a divine unity and its transcendental nature, up to fighting, for instance, the anthropomorphic as anthropomorphic every attribution of God. Of qualities that could be susceptible of recall, for analogy, human experience. So this was a pretty radical thought in many ways, as you understand, and they went as far actually as saying basically that in denying, as we were saying, the Quran as an eternal and uncreated divine word. So does it remember you anything? Because if you think about, we talked about on this channel about Bogomilism, as Qadarism. So these movements were essentially even denying, for instance, the material world in some measure. The Bogomilists denied that, first of all, that Christ had a human nature, because they considered everything human to be say physical to be evil. They even denied that he was crucified, because the cross in this sense is a material thing, so it couldn't be so, and it couldn't be venerated. It would have been outrageous for the divinity. And by the way, that's the reason why the Byzantines actually launched their only crusade, the only crusade in Byzantine history, because the Byzantines absolutely were very far from the concept of crusade by any standards. So the only time they launched a crusade was indeed against the Bogomilists. For this reason, because of how heterodox they were. So you can understand even the Mu'tazilites had partly such influences, and were influenced in fact by Neoplatonism in part, as other currents of Islam, by the way, so by Emanatism, like in the like the one of Plotinus back in the Hellenistic tradition. So, and what the Mutazilites were stressing in this sense was the not the attachment to the formal right, to the law, and that's it, but into they were preaching the moral responsibility of mankind as beings with as reasonable and free beings. Beings were free to decide and make the right choice. So they were even attributing a lot of importance to the intellectual abilities, which is something that also here was considered to be definitely risky and problematic in many ways. They believed, for instance, that that since God was just and wise, he cannot command what is contrary to reason, or act with disregard for the welfare of his creatures. So in this, good and evil are not determined by revealed scripture or interpretation of the scripture, but they are sort of rational, abstract categories that can be established through unaided reason. So, because knowledge is derived from reason, reason can be the final arbiter in distinguishing between right and wrong. Do you understand how risky this is from a theological point of view, from a doctrinal point of view? Basically, every person can come up and say, okay, with my reason I can determine what is right and what is wrong. Now this is pretty... If you think about it, the first thing comes into my mind, it's Frederick II of Hohenstaufen. You know, all the propaganda that was written about him at the time as an heretical, as an atheist. Obviously Frederick II was nothing but an atheist. He was a Christian. Because that's also what you hear weirdly around, that Frederick II was an atheist. But that's not the point. He was just an extremely intellectually developed man. And he was also open to, in this sense, to this Muslim world. We know that in his capital of Palermo in Sicily, he had his great Muslim thinkers of the time, some of the most educated people of the globe. He was extremely interested about Islamic philosophy. He knew about these debates. And there was much actually in Islamic culture at that time was being influenced by such thoughts. I mean, this idea of knowing, in a certain sense of surpassing the limits that tradition has posed in some measure, and kind of giving mankind the chance of investigating autonomously through knowledge. Now, this is something that was criticized to Frederick. There are many anecdotes and even pretty dark ones relatively to Frederick's curiosity towards the world and this idea of wanting to experiment reality. Think about because now we will arrive to that. But basically, the Mutazilite rationalism, together with the Ismailite intellectual commitment, there was on our basis mostly exoteric, but it still could be combined with rationalism. Was out there. It was in the books of Al-Farabi, of Avicenna. And those were studied also in the West. So this was, think about how that was really influent eventually also for, not just for the Islamic world, but also for part of the Islamic world, but also for the West. Reading Aristotle from mean, what was also fascinating, it was it was a sort of mix between Neoplatonic Immanuelism and the encyclopedism typical of Aristotle in here. I mean, it wasn't just a pure speculation. It wasn't just a matter of taking sides. It was also about studying. It was also about learning. Figure out how knowledge, in this sense, represent about the world, about the natural world, and natural philosophy was conceived to be so important. So both in Christianism and in Islam, you had a more traditional current that said, okay, you don't have to mind about knowledge because knowledge can lead you astray, it can make you become superb and bold, and you have to stick to the word of the scriptures, where it's the Bible, where it's Quran. So you see the similarities even in here that happen, and how heterodoxy was fought on relatively similar premises. Then it's very fascinating that eventually such thoughts, think about Aristotle, were eventually integrated by both cultures, partly in their knowledge of the world. So that is also meaningful, because you can't really do without knowledge as a civilization. So there were also, relatively to the Mu'tazila, there were also other subdivisions, and there was one of Kalam, for instance, that is sometimes known as even the Islamic scholastic theology, and it actually was born from defend Islam from doubters or detractors, but it went as far as considering the injunctions of God to be accessible to rational thought and to inquiry. So that reason basically is an effective means to determine what is just and religiously obligatory. This, by the way, as we were saying, Mu'tazilism started pretty early in time, and it had a great impact not just during the Umayyad Caliphate, but also and especially it reached its apex in the Abbasid Caliphate, and it went as close as the Caliph Al-Mamun. Now we will see that. That eventually he was enticed at the beginning by he was interested himself in such things, but for political reasons he had to refuse these preachings to be spread, and eventually he began persecution. So Mu'tazilism kind of declined eventually after the 10th century, and it became, especially by some Sunni scholars, actually as an heresy, and chiefly because there was the denial of the eternity of the Quran. So that was a pretty important eventual development that it could have taken other paths, telling the truth. So originally Al-Mamun, so let's look at Al-Mamun. Was I don't know if you know what he was. He was the 7th Abbasid Caliph. He reigned in the first decades of the 9th century. He was, that's the time actually where the Carolingian Empire in the West was at its peak. So there was also a lot of cultural exchange between the Caliphate of Baghdad and the Carolingian Empire, because those were the two main powers. And well, yeah, in the middle there was was the Byzantine Empire. There also was a force to be reckoned with, but this time the Carolingian Empire was even more powerful, telling the truth, and or at least it was larger, and there was a lot of contact actually between East and West at this time, because the Franks were very fascinated with Islamic civilization. It's funny because Baghdad and Aachen began to exchange gifts, diplomatic, to weave friendly diplomatic relations, and and while the Abbasid Caliph sent to the Franks extremely sophisticated gifts, mechanical say automatic machines, extremely refined textiles, and great achievements of their science, also their technology. The Franks sent them things like horses and all the typically rough and agricultural and military world things that the Franks sent there. Less, actually less precious textiles, but I mean it was a goodwill at least, and you can understand in this sense the difference, also the intellectual difference between the advanced Baghdad and the advanced Abbasid Empire and Caliphate, say better, and the strong but rather rough and Carolingian world. So Al-Mamun, he is known actually for the Mutazilism controversy. He fought extensively against the Byzantines. That's why he cared about the Franks so much. It wasn't just human sympathy, but business, as always. Obviously, they consider these all infidels, naturally, and vice versa, by the way, from the other side. And he has actually a great story, but maybe we will tell it in our time. His power went through civil war. It came out from internal strife, and he made it, however, to Baghdad, and to basically to maintain power and extending this as a huge influence. And his reign was definitely marked by this. And the Mutazilite controversy, and because initially you have to think there were many of such currents out there in Islam. So, and it was actually also a lot of doubt which one would have got prevalent. So it's obvious that the rulers would look at these options because they could back or counter their own authority in some measure. And it's fascinating because Al-Mamun was a very intellectually skilled person, and he was attracted by the Aristotelian and Greek rationalism that Mutazili theology was expressing. The use of reason is always fascinating, it's always enticing. But there were definitely other more traditional and literalist beliefs that also were very heavy, and for which everything that the faithful, the believer needs to know is written in the Quran and the Hadith. All the controversies that we have seen, and eventually the Al-Mamun had this initial adherence, if I've understood well, and then eventually he refused it. And another very interesting thing about Mutazilism in this sense, it had contacts with the Shia movement. So this is actually important because the Shiites were actually this other great branch of Islam that had begun to develop the more we'll see that especially with Ismailism later, but let's say that it was also very attractive. It had gone past the simple, literalist traditions that they had attached no authority to their to the imamate. That this is the main difference essentially for the Sunni the Islamic world is to be ruled essentially by the Caliphate, the Caliph, that is the successor. Literally, would be the successor of Muhammad. Actually, Caliphate and Imam are together in the Islamic world, but eventually the Shiites, the Imam is said is the one who design who is what points who is ahead, who is on the lead. So the the idea is that the Shiites attribute authority also in the whole Islamic world to the figure of the Imam. So the Imamate is loaded with much greater importance for them, whereas the Sunni, and like the Abbasids at this point, were instead they were for the Caliphate as a more let's say as a sort of more democratic sanction of who has to rule, because it was based on a sort of election. Then also in there were intersections, because succession could happen in many ways as well. But let's say that the Shiites instead believe that the authority actually passes from a descendant line, essentially. The Shia believe that the Imam's doctrine, their Imam's doctrine actually comes from the Imam authority comes from the fact that they are somehow descendants from Muhammad, from Muhammad's blood, from Fatima and etc. So that's where the Fatimid of Egypt actually come from, conceptually speaking. So that the Imam has this spiritual political authority over the community, and certain traits that are actually partly divine itself. So there are definitely also different Shia groupings. Today we'll see the Ismailis, but there are also the 12ers, the Zaydis, and that's it. But just for saying that it's a current of Islam that actually developed more exoteric thinking, that in this sense was interesting, let's say, also from an intellectual point of view. So the Mu'tazilite intellectualism looked at that as an interesting thing, and by the way, also as an ally against the leading traditionalist and literalist current that governed into the Sunni Abbasid Caliphate, and the Abbasid Caliphate, which was Sunni, and therefore looking at the Shia was a way to even find allies out of that. So but it's extremely more complicated. As you understand, I also have difficulties to explain this properly, but just for telling you how really complicated the whole story is, and this is an extreme synthesis. And so Shia Islam also has this tendency to intellectualistic elaboration that kind of pairs them with the Mu'tazilites. But in a very different way, naturally, because it has mostly to do with Shia has mostly to do with the meaning of to attribute to caliphal power, as we have seen, and with all the annexed problem of the descendants. This tendency of the legitimate caliphs from Ali and there was the son-in-law of Muhammad. So this because actually caliph and imams in this they're not actually oppositive. They exist in both worlds, but it's just the meaning that they're loaded with that are different, and around which the division between Sunni and Shia actually revolves. So how did the Mu'tazilites fall into this Abbasid context? Well, basically they began immediately to cause the reaction, as we've said, of the traditionalist theologians, and also within the people. So when Al-Mamun realized this, he said, "Okay, I can't support those, even if even if he was actually pretty interested in his ideas," and he basically lost the caliphal protection that had previously enjoyed, and they were in this sense also confused with the Shiite opposition. So that the Shiites at this point were was persecuted at this time. So it was actually a Shia opposition. The Shiites existed also into the Abbasid Caliphate, territorially speaking. Just today there are sects, I think, of of Shiites in the same area. Excuse me, I drink a little. So naturally today we're talking after 1,000 years of history, so eventually things got even more partly more complicated. But just for saying that in the Islamic world these different thoughts still coexisted at many times, side by side. And the Shiites in this were obliged basically to operate in secret. So because they would have been persecuted otherwise, and they developed certain exoteric tendencies of messianic character that had to do with essentially the waiting for the coming back of an imam. This is actually what the Shia is all about. So the imam, as we've seen, is this religious guide more than else, one who has to tell who is fit, who was not fit for Islamic standards, because he's inspired. It's inspired by God Himself. And this idea of the imam that basically disappeared, because you know that the Shia have this this idea that basically there is the martyrdom of Hussein. That was Hussein that was killed together with his followers, and around which also the whole Shiite psyche, let's say, revolves. This idea of martyrdom, of grievance, of sufferance, but of the idea that the spiritual authority of the Imam actually is still alive, and therefore that the Imam at this point has not really died. It's actually disappeared. And this is very complicated, because telling the truth, in history there have been actually these events of killings of these imams that are a series. By the way, the Ismailites, if I'm not wrong, believe this series of imams was 7. The 12ers believe it's 12. And at the end of this series there is basically this, it's a bit of a very eschatological perspective as well. It's messianic. There is a world, it's a bit like Christianity. I mean, there is a time into which there would be a divine rule on the earth at the end of times. It's very fascinating. And what is mostly fascinating from a historical, excuse me if I'm telling it messily, but from a historical point of view, is that these imams were actually taken out physically sometimes. But these traditions actually saw that as if a guy, in this sense, disappeared behind a column. Nobody saw it anymore, and because he was absconditus, like, okay, so he had disappeared. He's still here. He can also manifest in different ways, but he will have to come back. And so there was a miracle miraculous um, this con- concealing in a miraculous disappearance, demise. It was concealed anyway, and within these currents, at this time, Ismailism had a huge. So we've seen Mutazilism basically declined, having lost caliphal support. Kind of. At this time, there is instead a great expansion of Ismailism. So Ismailism is a branch, as we've seen, of Shia Islam, and it gets the name from Ismail ibn Jafar, that was appointed as the Imam, in fact, that is the spiritual successor of Jafar al-Sadiq, who was also it's thought to have been the sixth Shia Imam, and so this major figure, especially in the Hanafi and Maliki schools of theology, actually of Sunni jurisprudence, and he was descendant from of Ali. So this, you see, all the continuity with Muhammad's blood, that actually is what the because you have to think that in this sense the Shia were legitimizing people on the base of that, like the Fatimids of Egypt, who came to be this major power into the area from the 9th century, if I'm not wrong, began to, or the 10th, I don't remember. The Fatimids actually, yeah, from the 10th, not from the 9th, that could claim, I descend from Muhammad, from this line. So they could fake it even. You know, it's not something, you know, you have to think that politics was that sneaky. But in the Islamic world, that had a very important echo, it had a very important meaning. So by claiming that, you could obtain into the Shia Islam a huge power, politically speaking, because you were the one appointed by divine inspiration, practically, and in spiritual continuity with a series of imams that had definitely the this importance of, by the way, of materializing practically out of nowhere as well. So it could be also this favored partly the sudden appearance of even of this political, and this is very important in Islamic political. If you when you study Islam, you have to understand this, because it was a wholly different approach to constituted authority compared to Christianity, because Christianity said, yes, okay, if you have an evil ruler that is anti-Christian substantially, you have to fight against it. But tendentially speaking, this is something the Christians got straight from Judaic tradition. The scriptures say that whoever rules is put there by God. So in a way or in another, you have to fear it in a way that is also partly to respect it. And in general, if there is even obviously naturally Christian ruler, he is there for some reason. So he can be a sinner as well, but there is still a part of fear that you have to. Instead, in the Islamic world, it's a bit different. I'm not aware actually of the fear of this sense, but in the Islamic world, every let's say secular power. First of all, there is not really secular power in this sense, but there are concepts. For instance, the term Rex. That is king into the Rex is attributed also to Christ as a definition. So all the Christian political thinking has developed this holiness of the royal figure. The equivalent of Rex in Arab is Malik, and Malik is instead in Arab is loaded with extremely negative meanings, because it identifies basically the king as as a sort of fully earthly ruler, that in this sense has stolen the power from God himself. That was this Sharia is about. That law is not made by the secular powers, like in Christianity, where there is a divine justice and an earthly justice. I mean, the earthly justice obviously is faulty, also from a Christian perspective, but it's still important for it to be there. In the Muslim world, this there is practically not, because the law has to come straight from God. So implicitly, also the people who rise to power can be legitimized or delegitimized in this base. And if you look at the Islamic world, actually from a political point of view, it was pretty unstable this time. Also partly for these reasons. Obviously, there were major structural reasons for this as well. But generally speaking, these political upheavals sometimes were really triggered in large part by such beliefs. And you can see, in fact, how the Fatimids rose to power literally from nothing, just being followed because they were claiming to descend from Muhammad as rulers. And this is really the powerful thing. And that was done in the Shia especially, because that's what the... and they were, in this sense, the Fatimids were also delegitimizing the Abbasid rule of Baghdad. And you find all these divisions. You see, by the way, how these powers overlapped with this also major historical area of power. Like Abbasid Baghdad is Mesopotamian, Fatimid Egypt is Egypt. So these areas that always had some story before, that maybe they had enmity that predated the spread of Islam. Think about the Arab Peninsula. That's, there were hates in there that date to millennium before Islam. So this is also fascinating how these stones were actually declined also relatively to the local traditions. Why is Persia Shia, for instance? Why is Persia Shiite? And that has a lot to do with Persia in itself, not just with some random reason that made them Shiites. That obviously also thinking and, as we've seen, with the Mu'tazilites, even certain thoughts, certain currents could take other paths. But let's say that there are certain harbors into which there is more fertile ground for certain thoughts to develop also in political terms, and that's why I find, by the way, medieval Islam so fascinating. I had luck to make an exam, partly also on this on these topics when I was at university. I actually could choose that, and I chose. It was a very interesting exam course, and I've learned a lot of things, and probably my professor would be ashamed of the kind of just superficial nature in which I'm explaining all this, but it was really also about these topics, and I thought they were very, very interesting. Unfortunately, I had no chance to study for other Islamic history exam. That was interesting because it was about Middle Ages proper. I think I didn't choose others because they were either on the modern contemporary age, and so I preferred to do something more, had more to do with Middle Ages. But erase from your mind to know anything about European medieval history without knowing Islamic medieval history, because it doesn't make sense in the first place. So passing to Ismailism, given a bit of another bit of background of the Ismailis, of Ismailism as such. Basically, this was definition that was attributed to the Shia community, which, as we've said, during the religious conflicts of the 8th century, actually more political conflicts of the 8th century, recall, say, they were inspired by the a legitimate succession of of only one ruler. There was Ismail, as we have seen, who was son of this last sixth prestigious imam, and who basically claimed they deemed to be necessary the even the abandonment of eventually the imam tradition, because at the end of this series something else had of imams something else had to happen in this messianic perspective. So but this wasn't eventually done by the same Ismailites, and this community became a sort of extreme Shiism, with a very strong exoteric character. So kind of going past beyond that phase and living in this continuous moment of wait and of that went beyond in fact that the rule of the caliphs, of how the Abbasids had basically created it in this major, and living a bit as perceived as even themselves as a sort of minority, even if at a certain point Ismailism could be really powerful in the same Islamic world. So this exoteric orientation basically created different even initiation levels. So this was something that came straight from the ancient Hellenic beliefs, from the ancient exoteric traditions, their initiatic rites and all this stuff. So and this was a sort of a Gnostic thing, because you could basically through these various steps you could reach a doctrine that, not surprisingly in this sense, was permeated with this ancient belief that was pretty similar to the cosmic Neoplatonism. So a sort of hierarchy of entities that were generated by the one, the big, the divinity essentially, and so this is very complicated. But let's say that attached to it there was also a very complex theology of history as well, where basically the appearance of prophets, the disappearance of the imams that we've seen, and sufferings and persecutions until martyrdom, basically all were framed into a logical picture that had to make sense eventually in eschatological terms. And this was a very extreme branch of Shia Islam, and they required, in fact, also very thorough intellectual commitment, because they were based on this continuous research also for meanings, for knowledge. So it was a very complex doctrine. And so actually before we said that they went together in part with Mu'tazilism, well, even though they're extremely, there were certain political conveniences and affiliations, but it's not that Ismailism liked Mu'tazilism more than much. Actually they were pretty detached from Mu'tazilite rationalism, sorry. And in fact Mu'tazilism in itself actually fought conceptually against Ismailism. And if you really want to find an hair of of Ismailism, also in excuse me, an air of Mu'tazilism, you have to look at that in two other figures of great importance, like Al-Farabi, we were discussing before. Al-Farabi was in Western was Latinized as Al-Farabius. By the way, it's very, very nice. It's very fascinating how these names eventually entered also as into the Western memory, as this guy was called in Arab, I think, Abu Nasr Muhammad ibn Muhammad Al-Farabi. Al-Farabius in Latin sounds pretty funny. So he was actually an extremely famous thinker at the time, in generally speaking, in Muslim philosophy and literature. He lived between the end of the ninth and first half of the 10th century, and he was a philosopher and a jurist as well. So you have to understand in this sense that at that point, just like in Christianity, these figures were, for instance, first of all, at the time, there were lots of polymaths. There was relatively less to know. Indeed, well, there's always been too much to know for a single person, but there were these figures. I mean, education also was completely different. A lot of things learned by heart. I mean, a normal thing for priests in Europe, medieval Europe, was to know the Bible by heart. At least by certain standards, at certain times and places, that was something. You would say, how can you do that? Well, those people did that. Those people didn't spend their lives with a smartphone 10 centimeters from their eyes. They did that with the Bible, and they would learn it by heart. So there were these great scholars, these great thinkers who actually knew a lot of things. Al-Farabi wrote lots about political philosophy, metaphysics, ethics, logic, and you have to understand that if you are a believer in this sense, it doesn't matter whether you're a Christian or a Muslim, and you have this totalizing perception of, it's only in the West, it's only after the 30 Years' War that we have fully separated the state from religion in practice. At this time, people were reasoning with all one, as if it was all one thing. So you can't study political philosophy, you can write about political philosophy, but in your religious perspective, and everything goes accordingly. Metaphysics, ethics, and logic are all functional to describe this. Al-Farabi was also a natural scientist, a cosmologist, mathematician. He studied music. He taught music as well. Music was very, very important, both in Christian and Muslim world in the Middle Ages, because it was meant to represent the perfection of God. The Christian cathedrals in the Low Middle Ages were actually built not on Vitruvius architecture, but on the Musica from I think it was from Augustine, because that's the harmony of the proportions of light. Music was considered as all one with light. This is a pretty interesting thing, and in the Islamic philosophical tradition, Al-Farabi is considered the second teacher after Aristotle. Aristotle was the first one, so if you think in Islamic philosophy, Aristotle owns the first place. And just like eventually with Christianity, when Aristotle was integrated by Thomas Aquinas and into the Christian metaphysics, essentially, and he had this huge access. We think these figures, as we were saying, had this incredible access to ancient Greek texts, and he was extremely influential. He influenced Avicenna, as a matter of fact, that we named also as the other major legacies owner of the Mu'tazilites, and Maimonides. So Maimonides is famously another. He was actually a Jewish philosopher, and he was practically the greatest, the most influential Torah scholar of the Middle Ages. So also think about Judaism having this important space into the Islamic world as well. So Al-Farabi had really he was read as Al-Farabius, in fact, also extensively in the West. So an extremely important figure. And then so Al-Farabi was Turkish, by the way. This is also interesting because it's the Turks that began basically to arrive into the Islamic world. I make a video that is getting also some decent view about the Seljuk Turks in the Islamic world, in which I discuss a little bit how the Turks entered into this broad Islamic universe and what their role was, how Al-Farabi was Arab, and he actually lived, as many Turks at that point, was a Turk, sorry, he lived into Baghdad for his rather long life, and for the time standards, and also in Syria, and so he was really at the center of some of the most advanced words of Islam. Mesopotamia, Syria, some of the most advanced, intellectually advanced areas of the world at that time. Then Avicenna, as well, as a Mu'tazilite haired, we can say, he was Persian instead. This is also interesting. You understand that how these figures that were not Arab, but how they were so integrated into Islamic culture, and how what a great contribution they gave, also on the basis of the fact that they weren't Arab, and that they brought so into Islamic tradition also other legacies of their personal, especially with Persia. That was this I mean, the Turks maybe didn't bring that huge much, but surely they had. They were, I mean, in theological or philosophical way, but they had. That's the mindset. What we were telling before, that certain peoples that came relatively out of the blue sometimes in terms of civilization had less cultural resistance, that could absorb much better knowledge and to give this better synthesis, this original thinking and all. Avicenna was Persian instead. He lived between the end of the 10th and beginning of the 11th century, so we're a bit later. He is also known actually as Ibn Sina, I believe it's pronounced, or Abu Ali Sina. And he was another polymath. So Persia, this huge civilization that from which, by the way, the same Abbasid Caliphate was so massively, but which also the Abbasid Caliphate was massively influenced. The Abbasid, when the Arabs created the Caliphate, they had essentially two imperial models, the Roman one and the Persian one, and then eventually the Persian one was more influent for obvious reasons. Because eventually Persia got Islamic, and and Baghdad is pretty close to Persia, right? Much closer than Constantinople, that it was its enemy instead. So I don't think we have to introduce Avicenna, but he is this extraordinary figure. He's mostly regarded as in the Islamic Golden Age between the 8th and 14th century, he was this huge scientist, chiefly medic, then philosopher, and also politician. So he was very well versed in astronomy, and as well, he has written. He's credited to have written over 450 works, of which around a half, a little bit less than a half, survived, including 150 on philosophy and 40 on medicine. So think at the fallout, what having written 450 works. Think about also how this knowledge could fare at that time, could travel. The Middle Ages were the greatest moment of history in terms of thirst for knowledge. Uh, these books were devoured at the time, and his most important works are the book on healing, that is this scientific and philosophical encyclopedia, also known as The Cure, or Heal. And this is obviously also metaphorical. It's not just about medicine, it's also about this healing of the soul. These were concepts that actually you see that both the Christians and the Muslims were inheriting from the ancient world. Think of Epicurus, the Quadripharmacus, and this idea that the fitness of the soul went along with the fitness of the body. They were essentially reformulating these concepts, looking at those ancient authors. But also the canon of medicine. It was completely in 1025. It became basically the standard medical text at most medieval universities. I mean, we kept using it for until the 17th century. I mean, just think about these people, how they could cover this whole world. This is something we don't do anymore. I mean, if I tell you this guy studied and taught and wrote about astronomy, alchemy, geography, geology, psychology, theology, Islamic theology, logics, mathematics, physics, poetry. Now, today, unfortunately, from the Enlightenment, we got this idea that these are all separate categories, and we can't separate ourselves from such a thought. But at the time, it was all one, in many ways. And yes, okay, they were also trying to categorize a little themselves. But the main point is that all these disciplines corresponded to a whole picture of the world as a great ensemble, as a creation, by the way, as a divine creation. And think of how these parts, of what this entail, how these parts were all intertwined. Okay, you couldn't think of geography if you for him, if you don't think of what theology meant for him, because they're all intertwined. So both Al-Farabi and Avicenna, why did we basically came them out? Because they basically managed to contemporate both that Neoplatonic emanatism that we have seen was proper of Ismailism with and together with its mystical inspiration, that, let's stress it, was all once with them, together with the Aristotelian scientific encyclopedism. So they managed to bring together these two great philosophical traditions not just of the Muslim world, but also of the ancient world. Because in this sense, Mu'tazilism had developed from Greek rationalism, from science, from Aristotle, and that was it. It was a pillar, one of the pillar, and the other was Ismailism, which instead had referred to whom? To Platonism. So this great, even exoteric conception, obviously those were mostly Neoplatonic rather than Platonic texts. Also because, by the way, up to that time they couldn't really distinguish the two things, at least I believe, because at least in the West, up to the Renaissance, they translated Plotinus as if he was Plato. Actually, also it accomplished the fact that the sounds, the name actually, the name sounds actually similar. But this is the two great pillars that of the ancient world, Aristotle and Plato. And so the Muslim world approaches these two ideas respectively from Mu'tazilism in the other one, and from Ismailism, not just from those actually, because the whole Islamic world was more or less concerned with this ancient past and knew that. And you have in this great golden age of Islam, philosophy, science, and all, this extreme synthesis of the two things that are very difficult to reconcile in part, that eventually would give rise, and the Westerners came later on the base also partly of this treatises, because when Avicenna was read into Paris, it was the main Christian theological school at that time. Everybody went crazy because they loved Aristotle, and the popes were freaking out because basically you had a whole new system that came straight from this great Hellenic and Muslim traditions synthesized, and that were more advanced than their own. So it took the scholastics to say, okay, let's integrate Aristotle also in Christianity in a way we can, and that's where Thomas Aquinas and comes into play, just for saying how, I mean, works like these and that came from these currents eventually had this huge impact in turn into into the Christian world. And think about it, for our history, I don't know how Aristotelianism influenced our view, scientific research into the Renaissance, I mean, it's all that intertwined. Never think that there was a sharp division. Here there were the Christians, here there were the Muslims. They lived in different ways. It was all there were all thoughts flowing continuously. And the Middle Ages were really about this, accumulating knowledge, getting from all possible worlds knowledge to get together to try to understand the greater, the superior, the hidden symbolism of the created universe. That is a duty for a believer to do. So there was also an ethical response, meaning attached to this. This is what I would like to make you understand. It's not pure intellectual virtuosism. It was really felt as a moral need. Just like in both worlds, both in Christianity, both in Islam at the time. And so that's why also why there were so many interests in common, because practically the intentions were the same. And this also posed the problem of making these two civilizations actually acknowledge one another, what they were thinking, and maybe taking partly things from that. In fact, the Aristotle that was known into Western Europe wasn't the Aristotle of 4th century BC. He was Aristotle of mediated by the Muslims with all their traditions. Like Avicenna had a huge, bias, obviously, from his background, from his Islamic background, from his Persian background, that eventually molded also the Aristotelic system that he created. So the Christians were thinking to read Aristotle, but as a matter of fact, were reading also a big part of other things, including Platonism. That was partly into that, but lots of other things. So even this in turn influenced certain views of the world, of eventually that Christian metaphysics of how it was created eventually in the 13th century. So these are all very, very, for a thinker, for a person who wrote this, for a living being, you have this huge fallout that changes history literally from its roots. And so, in fact, it's very fascinating that at the same time, when these thinkers in the East were producing such works, in the West, in the Latin West, you find these very bitter arguments, but the contrasts between the so-called dialecticals and anti-dialecticals. We're essentially doing the same thing. Do we have to believe in words for what they mean? Think about the controversy of the dispute on the universal meanings. The idea is our names actually created on the on with a meaning in it, like do properties exist as such, what they are? Properties are, this was a metaphysical problem. So if the properties exist, and if they do exist, what are they really? So for instance, qualities and relations were referred as to universals, and this is something that went on really for lots of times. There were really many currents that really had many, even very bitter clashes one with another, chiefly fortunately only from an intellectual point of view. But think about this is something actually started back in the late Middle Ages, but you see that it's in this point, not in the late antique. Think about Boethius, at least if you take Porphyrius Isagoge, for instance. He says that I shall omit to speak about genera and species as to whether they subsist in the nature of things or in mere conceptions only, whether also if subsistent they are bodies or incorporeal, and whether they are separated from or insensibles or subsist about these, for such a treatise is most profound and requires another more extensive investigation. Think about Duns Scotus, and he was actually pretty harshly against nominalism and conceptualism, and he proposed a realism as a response to Abelard's conceptualism, for instance. Take Occam. Well, we are a bit already late into the Middle Ages, but relatively late. I mean, at least in a moment at this point in which certain things that had already been extensively debated and partly settled, but think about Thomas Aquinas as well, that he said essentially the essence of both the essence of a thing and its existence are clearly distinct. This is not a few to say into the medieval world. and the Scotists instead argued that in a thing there is no real distinction between the essence and existence. Instead, there is a sort of formal distinction that is basically, uh, let's say, a sort of an intermediate distinction between a mere conceptual and a fully real or mind-independent one. Now, well, we won't get into this now, but just for saying that these eventually what this is what also the medieval the Latin world was and was heading to in compared to into the relatively to what the Muslims had already studied and they gave them food for thought essentially. But what is most important in this sense is that there was an authority that kind of stamped even certain too bold intellectual production, let's say. The idea of an unscrupulous thought is really at the base of the Middle Ages, as you can't say more than that. There are many examples relatively to this in the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, where he says, for instance, with Mutazilism, if you think of the Mutazilists at withdrawers in a certain sense, as they were called in this sense, from even the clashes that were occurring into the Islamic world at the time. Think about the commitment that existed also for, in this sense, for moral reasons that were all one with political ones. Well, in the comedy, Dante places the so-called basically, I'm searching you for the translation if this thing work. Here it is. So Dante places these people who essentially withdrew from the political commitment, from taking a side essentially, as there is a beautiful term in how Dante uses it. Here in English I don't find a good translation, but it would be essentially the indolence or the slothfuls, the sluggish, but it's really felt in a much deeper way, and it's in a much more moral way. It is the person who does not participate, who doesn't take a side. That's what Dante was criticizing. He was essentially saying, you have to pick a side. You can't just withdraw from the world, because if you withdraw from the world, you're essentially giving up the chance for doing the good or even the bad choice. In fact, these indolents are condemned. They do not go to hell, because they are not worth it, even of hell. Because those who were sent to hell were, at least they had made a choice. That was Dante's logic. The indolents hadn't. So their eternal pain consisted basically in remaining at the gates of hell, outside of it, and to be condemned to basically run around continuously while being aggressed by these swarms of locusts and other insects, just to run for eternity, because they had refused to take a side into political fight. And just think, Dante's reality was one of continuous political and military strife at all levels of society. So in a time like the 8th, 9th century Muslim world, the Mu'tazilites were implicitly also saying we don't care about these clashes. I mean, to us, we can give we can give them our sympathy in the sense that we think, okay, well, these were seemingly more rational people who didn't want to fight. Again, yeah, it's nice, but that's because we are in 2019. If you had been living in those days, that was something shocking, partly because it was a moral duty to participate to this, to have an opinion and to fight for it. It's very difficult for us to understand from an ethical point of view, but it was really, really important for those times. So what I wanted to say about the Mu'tazilites, oh yeah, also the fact, the problem with authority. So the from not from a strictly political, but also from an intellectual point of view. That is still political, as we've said, but you have seen what Al-Mamun basically firstly likes the Mu'tazilites, and then he bans them, he persecutes them, and they decline. Well, that was because that happened similarly between in Christianity and Islam, because in Christianity there was always a check to see if your ideas were heterodox or not. So there were times into which the Church of Rome kind of decided to integrate part of these movements. I made a lot of videos actually about the evangelic poperistical movements. How many times I repeated this word in those videos, because those were eminently heterodox, and the Roman Church decided at a certain point that those who had maintained the best orthodox standards could be saved, in the sense, and integrated into the into the Roman Church, institutionally speaking, as mendicant orders, by the way. But there was this constant tension between those who actually went beyond, who had an intellectual, an autonomous intellectual, an intellectual autonomy, indeed, and who could be dangerous because they could start saying things that were against the establishment. These were concrete problems. I mean, today, as modern people, we have kind of interiorized this process as from the Illuministic perspective of the poor free thinker that is so just and good, and all this society is evil because it's made up of bigots. But consider if you were a medieval ruler, and you start having unrest and social disruption because there are factions that start fighting over these new ideas. That's a serious problem. You have an ethical responsibility, even as a religious ruler, to say, okay, this thing might be end with blood, but it might end for good. It's always better than making this going into civil war and to make the whole thing crumble. I mean, heresies were, in this sense, conceived detrimental to the social order into both the Christian and the Islamic world. It was a matter of bigotry. You don't have to think of these people to be enlightened people as well, for our standards. I mean, even these free thinkers, they weren't free thinkers at all at this time. This time there was really anything like a free thinker. You could be more or less autonomous, but your thinking essentially was revolving around certain traditions, certain authorities, as we've seen. These people were still either Christians, either Muslims. So the free thinking is something that, even in terms also of autonomous critical skill, something much later. I'm not saying that a religious person cannot be a free thinker at all. I'm just saying that that's what I was saying in the beginning, this dichotomy, the Mu'tazilites were rationalists and the others were the traditionalists. Yeah, I mean, you can't say that, but never think that the first were the good guys and the other were the bad guys. They were good and bad, both mostly in the same way, and probably for our standards, they were all evil in the first place, because it was a wholly different world from moral point of view. Although we should point out that into this moment, both in the Christian and Muslim world, there was a, already a pretty good advanced core of beliefs that are essentially the same humanistic ones that we conceive today, and that are still the base of our identities. But it's interesting that in the same periods, more or less in the same periods, Christianity and Islam underwent the same changes. Let's say that they had these very similar philosophical problems in many ways. It was definitely relatively to this tradition, let's say resistances. There was a figure that is Al-Ghazali, who was he was another Persian, telling the truth. So always see Persia, that more or less in this Islamic world, despite Persia in this sense was very important, but not the center of the major power that now was the caliphate, the Abbasid caliphate. Always came in, always had this, because the Persians had this great cultural background, and they joined to these debates very thoroughly. And Ahmad Ghazali, he lived essentially the second half of the 11th and the first part of the 12th century. He taught in Baghdad and in Syria once again. So we have seen just like Al-Farabi, essentially the same places, but the same places where with Islamic philosophy was mostly active. And he actually was a traditional because he criticized the rationalistic excesses that this philosophy, the Al-Farabi's and Avicenna's philosophies had essentially gave origin to. And he is very important because he basically gave origin to a mystical counter-reaction into the Islamic world. He was, by the way, he was also another great treatiser. He wrote lots of mystical and theological books. He was also a theorist of mystical love as well, and he also wrote actually about this love that goes beyond just also the same spiritual nature. He wrote about lovers as well, and I would like to find more information about him. If you gave me a second, I hadn't really prepared all of this before. Yeah, he also was influenced by Neoplatonism, by the way. So it's also very interesting. So this idea of love that goes a bit beyond. So mysticism was evidently a bit all around. We have seen that even Al-Farabi and Avicenna had partially conjugated the they had kind of made an hybrid of Neoplatonism and Aristotelianism. Ahmad Ghazali was very important because he called for this deepening of the ascetical and mystical religious experience. So not just the unscrupulous use of reason, but also something that goes closer to the divinity from an ascetic way. And this was actually in continuity with a current of Islam that is in fact Sufism. That is our last topic of conversation today. Sufism is something actually that dates to a very early in time to the Islamic history, since the first century of Islamic history, and by the so-called the Sufi, in fact, that are these ascetics, simply as that we can call them, even though it's a bit more complicated. It's not really Sufism, or also known as tasawwuf, is a very it's sometimes considered as this asceticism, or better, mysticism of Islamic tradition. It's more sort of an inward dimension of Islam, so it's something that goes a bit beyond. Today we think about mysticism in the West as a bit of a different kind of radical experience, kind of fundamentalist experience in part. I mean, as a very extreme form of relation with the divinity. In part, the Sufism is something that goes a bit like for other Muslim practices. It's a sort of values and doctrines and institutions that in this sense it can be very broad. So it's also being crystallized in the sense that Sufism, especially today, is a bit the result of a historical process that was much broader at the beginning, and that in this sense has been partly crystallized. There are also other forms of, and now I don't want to get extremely in detail into this, but let's say that first of all, where does this take the name from? Well, Sufi simply means it comes from wool. Suf means wool, I think, in Arab, and so this actually came from the clothes, the poor clothes that these people were wearing. So in this ascetic fashion, very simple clothing, like say medieval Christian monks could wear. Not say to wear the essential, because that's what Sufism can interpreted, and this is what I want to say relatively to parallelism between Christianity and Islam. It can be equated partly to certain monastic experiences of the Christian world. This time, monasticism also in here was something that both the Christians and the Muslims were essentially, in spite of their different religious beliefs and sensitivities, were essentially inheriting from the ancient world, in part from this world of I mean, even Christian monasticism is something that I made a video which is called The Roots of Christian Monasticism, that tells you how actually Christian monasticism itself actually came from other forms of ascetical practices that existed all over Asia at the time, and so that might be useful if you want to understand what I'm talking about. So the Sufi basically gave birth to this mystical movement that reached also in here its height chiefly in the 10th century, and their idea was essentially to, also in here it's interesting, to withdraw from the world, to get closer to God. This is pretty in this sense it's pretty similar to what the Christian monks were doing, but I'm stressing this once again because this idea of the withdrawal of is what you find in other forms from an intellectual point of view into Mutazilism. So when Ghazali was criticizing Mutazilism and asking for a more ascetical and mystical let's say approach to religion, he was partly probably making this parallel between Mutazilite withdrawal from the world and one of Sufism. One interesting thing about the Sufism that also makes some interesting point, a different point with Christianity is that God cannot. I mean, you can get closer to God in this process, but it's really unintelligible. It's inaccessible in ultimately. So the result of this is that also of this conception is that that was developed, by the way, over time. So it's not something that began. There were many different experiences at this point of these movements as well at the same time. But the ultimate stage was practically is to practice mystics without ascesis. Because also from this point of view, in Islam, the let's say distancing yourself from from human nature was not well seen, because that was seen as disrespectful towards God. Mm? So we've seen that, for instance, the Mutazilites. There's a parallelism with Mutazilism as well, because those said the Mutazilists said that that God cannot have any form of anthropomorphic attribution. So if you want to deny even your same humanity, you're kind of crossing a line that, first of all, is impossible to do, but it kind of predisposes you innerly as a negative person. It's like in Dante's comedy, what Ulysses is punished for. He's an extremely smart person. He wants to go across and to reach the earthly paradise. He even reaches he even arrives inside of that with his ship, but then he's swallowed by the waves and he sinks and then dies, and that's it. So even here the parallelism with Christian and Islamic horizons were pretty similar at the time. There is a limit that cannot be surpassed, and naturally this is not what comes out of these particular religions, nor as from monotheism. I mean, the monotheisms have developed more thoroughly these ideas, but this inherent idea that mankind cannot be immortal, for instance, is something you find since the myth of Gilgamesh, and so even in here, maybe today as modern people we say that as a sort of an oppressive or obscurantist idea, but it actually, also in scientific terms, it's pretty correct. I mean, we as humans, we have certain limits that evidently we cannot surpass. So these philosophies actually were pretty deep, in my opinion, and there are many characters about it that are worth a lot of attention, also for understanding our own world in some measure. Now, another word about Sufism, relatively to its monastic character. Actually, the Sufism was divided into orders, just like the monastic orders in Christianity. These orders were called Turuk, and they were congregations really formed with even grandmasters, like think about the grandmasters of the monastic chivalric orders into the West. By the way, consider that also we know that during the Crusades, even certain Eastern influences coming from the Eastern monasticism came back partly into the daily life of Christian monastic orders of chivalric orders into the Holy Land, and partly were inspired also by these Islamic congregation practices. That is very interesting. the interesting thing also in here is the continuity that is traced to the to Muhammad, because basically the Wali, that would be the Grand Master. Wali is an Arabic for custodian, protector, helper, even friend. So you get the sense of this totalizing experience in the human relations too. Was connected to Muhammad as an Islamic prophet in a series of in a chain of successive teachers, basically handed down as knowledge. In Arabic, this chain is called silsila. This chain link connection, and it's actually the same name for the religious order in the first place. Of the word order proper. That is the orderly succession of this spiritual genealogy. And so there is even a process into which the Sufi masters transfer these properties to their spiritual successors, or descendants, so how you want to call them. So Sufism implies certain spiritual sessions, meetings. There is this the idea of perfectioning of worship. The hadith actually has a lot to do with this. The hadith is the records of customs of Muhammad, essentially the words, actions, and even silent approvals that came from Muhammad lifestyle. So aside from what was written in the Quran, the Islamic tradition has wanted to base also part of it of their behaviors on and beliefs on such acts. So it's important that in Sufism there is this continuity with that, and as well in fact, Muhammad is taken as the ultimate model of this this spirituality, this obviously, and yeah, and most of the Sufi are Sunni as well. But even Shia Islam has developed this, especially from the late medieval period, and this is important because it's still something that pertained in this sense to a sort of, I mean, the Sunni idea that there could be a spirituality, but even the political affairs, let's say the community's affairs, worked on other standards. So not like with Shia that generally tended to look at the whole thing in this exoteric meaning as once. So as we were saying, this thing gained, as the Sufism actually gained momentum, also not just to respond to rationalism, but also to let's say to worldliness as well, which could also get together, by the way, because you have to think of this great there is an intrinsic attrition obviously that existed between also in Christianity, between the power and the Christian ideals. Take Frederick II, that I like to mention rather often, especially today, is that he was the Holy Roman Emperor, right? So he was the greatest power in the world of Western Christendom. And there is an inherent, if you look at Christian literature, philosophy, I studied this. I remember in my master thesis there is this idea. It was also taken from classic ideas, so even pagan models. That it is the idea that the extremely wealthy guy is obnubilated by his wealth, and it goes accordingly with this purely secular perception of the world, into which also rationalism can fit in. And when you think about when the Umayyad Caliphate was created, so after the 30, the Umayyad Caliphate lasted from 661 to the mid of the 8th century, so it was this huge power. The Arabs, by the way, had never seen up to that point, because they came from tribesmen, semi-sedentary, semi-nomad tribesmen of the Arabian plateau, of the Hijads, to conquer a huge area. So it was unprecedented. I mean, probably the Arabs from there felt even before Islam, even I'd say even aside from Islam, and also from their ancient Arabic or traditional lifestyle, we can say the inherent evil that could sparkle for having too much. Actually, the Islamic culture in this is very nice for the idea of earthly goods, because in the Christian world there is this constant idea that, yeah, good things can come, but essentially God loves the most people who suffer, because those are their favorites. So even if you have a meager life, that you should consider yourself fortunate, because the last will be the first in the kingdom of heaven. Islam is very different, and it actually starts from the idea that if you have a decent amount of wealth, you have to take it that as a divine benediction, and there is really nothing bad in enjoying it. Obviously, always with moderation. That's why the Sunni can't drink. They have formalized it in two different ways. The Sunni, for instance, can't drink alcohol, whereas the Shia can, but they can't smoke. So everyone basically found a vice, something that could obscure their minds, which is actually a metaphor, because technically speaking, if you look at the scriptures, there is no explicit mention of this. There is just a phrase, I think, in the Quran that says that simply you don't have to take anything that kind of intoxicates you, but it's not a mechanic thing. It's a metaphor for everything that can basically divert you from the whole, say, good Muslims, spiritual, goodness. So eventually this was excuse me, was kind of reduced to that at a ritual form, but the meaning is much broader, evidently. So the Muslims are for instance, there are even certain local traditions that exist in Europe because of this Muslim concept of lust for life, in part. That is, for instance, the Sicilian pastry. Sicily is famous for its pastry, and that's because the Arabs liked pastry. They don't consider gluttony to be a bad thing. It was a blessing from God, and as long as you did that in a measured way, and that's how we have that tradition. So it's kind of interesting. All these, I'm really fascinated as a Westerner with all these intersections with the Muslim world. I was talking about before, incidentally, with the, especially relatively to the Ottoman Empire, that I find increasingly more fascinating. And I realize I don't really talk much about Islamic history, but every time I do, I kind of understand it's important, and people should study it, in my opinion, because you learn really so much about our own. I mean, even if you are including me, I consider myself a Westerner, but I can't avoid to see that we took that from other, lots of things from other peoples and civilizations and cultures that are also similar to us in many ways. So I think these are kind of important things to say. So this was a very unexpectedly a very long video. No, well, not unexpectedly. I think that this was a very bad synthesis for such big topics like Mutazilism, Ismailism, and Sufism. So this was a bit of a run, and I don't know how well it turned out. I actually tried to feel bits this with other things because otherwise I would have been able to say a very few in specific terms. But I hope anyhow that you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please share it, or otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.